What if your own father put a price on you and handed you over like merchandise to a stranger? This is Sarah's story. An 18-year-old girl sold as if she meant nothing. No choice, no voice, no future. She was thrown into a truck and taken to an isolated farm, where a man known for his cold silence would become the guardian of her fate. But what no one knew was that something extraordinary would happen on that dry land. Because love, the real kind, the kind that heals and rescues, doesn't arrive with promises. It's born in the middle of fear. It grows between wounds, and it blooms where no one believes life can exist. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a story of pain, of deep silences, of memories that hurt. But more than anything, it's a story about starting over. If you've ever felt invisible, discarded, or trapped with no way out, stay. Because Sarah's story will touch your heart and maybe remind you that even when everything seems lost, love can still be born where no one ever planted hope. It was summertime in the dry interior of Texas, and the heat felt like it could bend the whole earth. The sky, cloudless and crushingly blue, pressed down on the landscape, while red dust rose with every step. In a small, weathered wooden house with crooked windows and creaking floors, something was happening, something that would change a young girl's life forever. Sarah was just 18, but her eyes held a kind of maturity that didn't match her age. She'd grown up surrounded by silence and hard chores, always trying to find beauty in small things. The sound of wind in the dry trees, the smell of bread burning in the wood stove, the rare touch of her mother's hand before bed. Even so, she carried a fragile hope in her chest, the belief that maybe one day life could be different, that maybe there was something out there, beyond the crooked fence and her father's harsh words. That morning, she woke up with a strange feeling. The air was heavier. The heat arrived before the sun even touched the windows. The house felt unusually quiet. The smell of reheated coffee drifted from the kitchen, and outside, the chirping of crickets blended with the distant lowing of cattle. Sarah walked down the stairs slowly, as if afraid of what she might find. With each step, her heart tightened. When she reached the living room, she saw her mother standing in the doorway, eyes misty, lips trembling, as if trying to say something but unable to. Her fingers twisted together nervously, and her whole posture seemed smaller, like someone who had lost too many battles and learned to suffer in silence. Out front, an old truck sat idling, smoke and heat pouring from it. Leaning against the back, a man watched everything in silence. He was tall, wearing simple clothes, dusty boots, and a weathered leather hat. His eyes, hidden beneath the brim, gave nothing away. No anger, no kindness, just a quiet, empty void. That was Thomas. Sarah didn't know his name yet. All she felt was the chill running down her spine as she noticed his stillness, the complete absence of emotion in his eyes. Inside the house, her father, Gerald, smoked impatiently. His calloused hands clutched an old mug, but his eyes were sharp as blades. "Sarah, come here," he said, not even glancing at her. She obeyed, not understanding. Inside, her heart pounded unevenly. A part of her already sensed what was coming. Maybe that's why her palms were sweaty and her feet felt glued to the floor. Gerald didn't bother with pleasantries. He simply turned to Thomas and extended his hand. "It's done," he said. "She's yours now." The words dropped like thunder in the stifling room. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Sarah didn't move. She stood there, trying to process what she'd just heard. "She's yours now," as if she were an object, a thing, a trade. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. It felt like the house itself had stopped breathing. Sarah's eyes searched for her mother's, but all she saw was a single tear falling, just one. As if there weren't any more left after a lifetime of crying. Her face held an ancient pain, buried, suffocated, and guilt, the kind that doesn't need words to scream. Near the doorway, a canvas bag sat on the floor. Inside, a few coins clinked, and next to it a cow's head. The trade, the price of a life, the price of a daughter, a slab of meat and a handful of cold metal. That's how Gerald valued his own child. "Women ain't good for anything anyway," he muttered, spitting on the floor like someone closing a dirty deal. Thomas said nothing. He gave a brief nod and turned toward the truck. His silence was as brutal as any word. He walked with the weight of habit, like someone used to doing this. No hesitation, no looking back. Sarah didn't react. She didn't scream. She didn't run, not because she agreed, but because she was in shock. Her legs shook, her body stopped obeying. Inside her, everything was spinning, and in that moment, she stopped being a daughter, a girl, a person with dreams. She became a burden, a virgin girl, as her father had proudly emphasized during the deal, with disgust, but also pride, an untouched product. Her mother walked over to her slowly, pulled her into a tight, silent hug. It was brief but intense, a desperate gesture from someone trying to say everything they'd never said in 18 years. When she let go, her hands still trembled, reluctant to release her. But she did. Sarah walked toward the truck. Each step felt like it weighed a ton. The ground groaned under her worn boots. Thomas opened the passenger door. He didn't speak, just waited. She climbed in. As the truck pulled away, red dust swirled and covered everything. The landscape slowly vanished. The wooden porch, the crooked fence, the empty chicken coop, the backyard where Sarah used to play with rag dolls. All of it turned to memory, a bitter memory. Inside the truck, the silence was suffocating. Thomas drove with his eyes fixed on the road as if there was nothing to say. The cab smelled of old leather, dried sweat, and solitude. Each shift of the gears showed hands hardened by years of labor. But what stood out most was the coldness. He didn't look at Sarah, didn't ask her name, didn't offer any explanation. It was as if she didn't exist. The sun blazed outside. The dirt road rattled beneath the tires. And inside, Sarah felt herself unraveling. Fear, anger, helplessness, all tangled together. Every mile was proof. There was no turning back. Her life now belonged to someone else. No permission, no choice. The farm was still far away, but her sentence had already begun. Sitting beside the man who now held her fate, Sarah looked out the window and let a single tear fall. Not out of weakness, but grief, a farewell, a goodbye to who she had been, to everything she believed, and to a future that would never be what she dreamed. But somewhere deep inside, something refused to die. A spark, a faint forgotten whisper. The road to Thomas's farm seemed endless. The truck jolted over the ruts of the dirt path, kicking up a thick cloud of dust that swallowed everything in sight. Gnarled trees loomed like ghosts on the horizon, and the heat made the air feel heavy, almost hard to breathe. The engine rumbled steadily, while inside the cab, the silence remained, dense, tense, unbearable. Sarah stared out the window, but she wasn't really seeing anything. Her body was there, but her soul felt detached, hovering elsewhere. Her hands sat stiffly in her lap, and her eyes were lost in the distance. Everything felt surreal, like she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Thomas didn't speak. His hands gripped the wheel firmly, eyes fixed on the road. Every so often he adjusted his hat or wiped his brow, but he never looked away. He was like stone, unmoving, unreadable. Not a single question, not a single comment. As if transporting a girl traded for coins was just another chore. And for him, maybe it was. When the truck finally passed through the rustic wooden gates of the property, Sarah caught her first glimpse of the place she would now have to call home. The farm was big but bleak. Open land stretched out, covered in dry grass and scattered. Wooden barns that looked like they might collapse at any moment. A few horses stood in the distance, tied to a makeshift fence. Cows gathered in small groups, searching for shade where there was none. The main house, larger than her family's, but still simple, stood without paint, its windows hidden behind thick, rough fabric curtains. The truck came to a jarring stop, and the dust took several long seconds to settle. Thomas turned off the engine, removed his hat, and stepped out. Sarah hesitated before climbing down. The heat was even stronger here, and the thick smell of manure mixed with dry hay filled her nose as soon as her boots hit the ground. Thomas walked around to the back of the truck and grabbed a canvas bag, probably her clothes. He handed it to her without a word. "Come," his first word in hours. Sarah followed in silence, her heart pounding. Each step stirred up dust around her feet. The porch creaked beneath them, and the front door opened with difficulty. as if it hadn't been used in a long time. Inside, the house was dark and stifling, filled with the scent of aged wood and something that had been closed up too long. "This is your bed," Thomas said, pointing to a small room off the kitchen. There was no lock on the door. Inside, there was only a narrow iron bed with a thin mattress, a wooden stool, and a basin with a water jug. No decoration, no mirror, not even a real window, just a slit in the wall covered by a yellowed cloth. Sarah stepped inside and dropped the bag on the floor. The room didn't feel like a home. It felt like a storage space, a place where you put something you don't want to see. Thomas stood at the doorway for a few seconds, as if expecting a reaction, but Sarah said nothing. She just sat on the edge of the bed, unable to look at him. "No fuss," he said sharply. "If you want to stay here, you'll learn to do things my way." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar. His footsteps faded, blending with the ticking of an old clock somewhere in the living room. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to process what she had just heard. "If you want to stay." The phrase echoed in her mind, as if she had a choice, as if this were an invitation, not a sentence. She lay down with her boots still on. The mattress sagged to one side, and the wall smelled of old mildew. Outside, a cicada sang loudly. Time seemed to stop. It was as if this farm existed on the edge of reality, a place no one saw, no one knew, no one would ever intervene. Later that afternoon, Thomas called her out with a simple, "Come, time to learn the chores." No explanations. He took her to the back of the house and started, pointing, never speaking unto the tasks she would be responsible for: feeding the cattle, fetching water from the well, sweeping the barn, helping in the kitchen, collecting eggs, all of it under the sun or the moon, with no fixed schedule. The work was hard, the rhythm punishing. Sarah barely had time to understand how the farm worked. When she made mistakes, which was inevitable at first, Thomas corrected her with a cold edge. He didn't yell, but his tone was like steel. He'd point, redo the movement, and go back to silence. It was as if every error was a personal failure, but also as if he never expected much from her in the first place. In those first days, Sarah spoke very little, only what was necessary. She kept her pain to herself, saving her tears for when she was alone in her room at night, face buried in the thin pillow. But she never screamed, never begged. Some part of her already knew that pain like this couldn't be spoken. Not here, not to him. The days followed the same rhythm. Wake up before the sun, wash with cold water, drink bitter, quick coffee, endless labor, silence, more labor, a plate of rice and meat for dinner, with the clinking of cutlery as the only sound at the table. And Thomas, always there, watching, correcting, demanding, but never truly connecting. Sarah's body ached. Her hands grew calloused. Her skin burned from the sun, but she didn't complain. It was like something inside her had realized that survival depended on this, on not breaking, on learning quickly, on enduring in silence. In the first week, she burned the beans. The next day, she slipped and fell in the pig pen. Then she almost dropped the well bucket. Each time, Thomas responded with that same hard stare, but he never raised his hand, never shouted. His punishment was quieter, indifference. Sarah began to notice patterns. He always ate at the same time. He arranged his tools in a straight line. He cleaned his hat 3 times before hanging it up, and he hated questions. She learned that on the 3rd day, when she asked where the soap was. The look he gave her was so cold, it froze any future attempt at conversation. On that farm, silence was law, and Sarah, though young, learned fast how to survive inside it. But even in the midst of all that harshness, something within her refused to fade. A spark, a sliver of life. Every time she walked alone to the well and saw the wide sky above, the endless field, or heard the muffled chirping of crickets at night, something deep inside her remembered she was still alive. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of her story. The days began to blend together, as if they were all made from the same dry, weary mold. Wake up before sunrise, wash her face with cold water from the well, make bitter, silent coffee, put on the same thick cotton clothes, and then start it all over again. The farm had its own rhythm, indifferent to how Sarah felt. There was no room for complaints, no time to recover. The routine was a daily test of endurance, and Sarah, though still young, had to learn quickly. Thomas was always the first to wake up. His firm steps crossed the porch at 5 a.m. He followed the same path every morning, from the kitchen to the shed, where he tended to his tools, and then to the cattle pen. He never said good morning, never expected one. A glance and a nod were all it took to give his orders. Sarah had to take care of the livestock, feed the oxen, clean up the manure, make sure the troughs were clean. Then it was on to the chickens. The pigs sweeping the barn, scrubbing the kitchen floor, collecting firewood, helping cut hay, and hauling heavy sacks to the storage room. It was an exhausting, relentless cycle. No breaks, no days off. At first, she made a lot of mistakes. She dropped buckets, forgot instructions, let the fire die out. One day, she completely burned lunch and spilled a bowl of beans across the porch floor. Thomas watched every slip-up with sharp, unreadable eyes. He never yelled. He never exploded, but his cold, constant silence was punishment enough. "If you don't learn from the work, you'll learn from the consequence," he said one evening, not raising his voice, after finding her on her knees, crying while scrubbing the floor. Sarah swallowed her tears. She had learned how, not out of pride, but because she felt that if she let them fall too freely, she might drown in them. She cried alone in the small, dark room beside the kitchen, pressed the pillow to her face, as deflated as the hope she stubbornly kept inside her, and cried without a sound. Sometimes her hands were so raw they bled. Sometimes her feet were covered in blisters that burst with each step. But even then she kept going, because deep down she knew stopping wasn't an option. It was keep going, or disappear completely. The food was simple: rice, beans, dried meat, sometimes stale bread. Nothing was wasted. Every grain mattered. Sarah learned to cook as if she were sewing something. Delicate, measuring salt without tasting, counting minutes by the sun's position, feeling the heat of the wood stove with her palm. She became skilled even if no one noticed. Thomas's rejection was subtle but constant. He never praised, never thanked, never said anything was good, but he made sure to correct every mistake with curt remarks. "It's undercooked. This is crooked. Look how dirty that is." Even when she improved, even when she gave it her all, recognition never came. It was as if he had shut himself off from kindness, as if he didn't want to see her as anything more than an obligation. And yet, strangely, Thomas never laid a hand on her, never crossed into physical brutality. It was as though he had built an invisible wall between them. She belonged to the farm. Yes, but not to him. At least not yet. Sarah couldn't understand it. There were moments when he looked at her longer than usual, as if he wanted to say something. But then he'd turn away and return to silence. And she, unsure of what to make of it, simply kept going, one day at a time. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to understand the land better. She learned the cattle's paths, when to plant and harvest, the names of tools, which seeds needed more shade. The fields, dry and harsh as they were, began to teach her things no one ever had. And even in the hardest moments, there was strength rising from the ground itself. One afternoon, while struggling to draw water from the well, the bucket slipped from her hand and crashed to the bottom. The sound echoed like a slap. She sat on the edge, frustrated, exhausted, arms aching, and for a moment, she let herself collapse. She didn't cry, just breathed deeply, staring up at the wide, clear sky. And that's when she realized, within all that silence, there was also a kind of freedom. This wasn't a prison with bars. It was an open field, harsh and difficult. But oddly, she was starting to feel alive. No one called her useless. No one controlled her with screams. Thomas was cold, yes, but not violent. And in a way, that was already more than she'd ever had at home. At nightfall, she returned home with her clothes stained by dirt and sweat. She prepared dinner, set the table, and sat in silence. Thomas ate calmly, chewing slowly, eyes locked on his plate. Sometimes, he looked up at her for a few seconds, but he never spoke. When he finished, he simply wiped his mouth, stood up, and stepped outside to the porch. Sarah cleared the table, washed the dishes, and retreated to her room. In the second week, while cleaning the pen, she slipped and fell into the mud. Her arm got bruised, her face scratched. Thomas arrived a few minutes later. He saw her on the ground, bloodied, filthy, a distant look in her eyes. For a second, his expression seemed to soften, but he simply reached out his hand. She hesitated, then accepted. He pulled her up firmly, but not roughly. "Wash it," he said flatly. "Then finish," and walked away. Sarah stood there, feeling both physical pain and something deeper, something she didn't have a name for. But she also felt something new, a trace of humanity. Small, almost invisible, but it was there. She washed the wound with cold water, tied a cloth around her arm, and went back to the pen. She finished the task, alone, in the dark. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the crickets, her body aching. But strangely, for the first time since arriving, she didn't feel just fear. She felt something like determination, as if, with each passing day, she was putting down roots in that land, as if, little by little, even unwanted, she was claiming a space no one could take from her. And in the middle of that dry land, where nothing seemed to grow, maybe something was beginning to bloom. The sun was already high when Sarah was sent on a new task, gathering firewood from the back of the property, near the old wooden shed that had clearly been abandoned for years. As always, Thomas simply pointed in silence and returned to the kettle. Pen without a single explanation. Sarah obeyed, used to the dry orders, the heavy silences, and the weight of carrying everything alone, both in her arms and in her chest. She walked quietly, crossing the dry field, twigs snapping beneath her feet, sweat dripping down her temples. The old shed smelled strongly of damp wood and rust. One corner of the structure was caving in, and weeds grew through the cracked floor. She bent down to stack the firmer pieces of wood, when she heard, for the first time in weeks, a different voice, light, almost playful. "You really should wear gloves for that. Those splinters won't go easy on you." Sarah turned quickly, startled. A young man was leaning against the side of the shed, a crumpled cap on his head, a sweat-stained plaid shirt, and an easy smile on his face. He held a tool in his hands, but seemed to have stopped just to watch her. "I didn't see you coming," she said, unsure what tone to use. Caution, curiosity, fear. "I saw you first. I'm Jason." He wiped his hand on his pants and held it out to her. "Thomas's son. I was in the barn and saw you heading this way." Sarah hesitated for a second, then shook his hand, feeling a strange warmth. It was the first time anyone there had spoken to her with even a hint of kindness. Jason's eyes were light but not cold, and his presence seemed completely out of place in that harsh world. "I'm Sarah." "I know," he said, still smiling. "I heard my dad mention it. Well, he didn't really say it, more like grunted. But sometimes you can guess what he means." She let out a small laugh, surprised by herself. It had been a long time since she'd laughed, or even felt like laughing. "Do you live here?" "Not exactly. I'm just visiting for a few days. I work at another ranch further west, but I come help out now and then, mostly when the old man gets grumpier than usual." Jason didn't seem afraid of his father. He spoke of him with a mix of irony and restrained affection, like someone who knew Thomas's limits and silences well. Sarah watched him closely, noticing his ease, the way he moved like life wasn't heavy. "He never told me he had a son." "Didn't tell me he had someone living with him either," Jason said, half joking. "That's just how he is. Keeps everything to himself. Like feelings are some rare kind of currency." Sarah nodded slightly. For the first time, someone there seemed to see what she saw too. "Want a hand with the firewood?" he offered. She hesitated. She was used to doing everything alone. She didn't want to seem weak, but she was tired, and something in Jason's voice made it hard to say no. "Sure." The two of them started stacking the wood together. What usually felt endless suddenly became easier. Jason asked simple questions: where she was from, if she'd ever lived on a farm before, what she liked to cook. And Sarah answered slowly, like someone testing the water before stepping in. He didn't force conversation, didn't look at her with pity. There was a naturalness in his presence that made time feel different. The talk flowed easily with soft pauses, like they'd known each other longer than they really had. "This must be tough on you," he said at one point, his eyes sincere. Sarah lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond. So much was hard, and she wasn't used to anyone acknowledging it. It is, but I'm trying. Jason nodded seriously, then ran his hand over the back of his neck, thoughtful. You know, my dad wasn't always like this. When I was little, he used to laugh. Told terrible jokes, but he laughed. Then, when my mom died, it was like something inside him shut off. He became one of those men who survive instead of live. Stopped seeing people as people, just sees duties, like life's a machine. Sarah went quiet. His words struck something deep in her, because in a way, she knew that pain too, watching someone you love fade away. My mother, she began, voice hesitant. She's still alive, but it's different. She chose silence. Jason looked at her with respect, patient, like someone who knew that some wounds don't need fixing, just space. Still, you're here. Still trying. It's all I have left, she said softly. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of understanding, like both of them were saying things no words could really express. When they finished stacking the firewood, Jason picked up a dry branch, snapped it under his foot, and handed it to her like a small reward. This one's good for starting the fire, or you can keep it as proof of my impressive branch-breaking skills. Sarah smiled. A real smile, still shy but genuine. For the first time since she stepped onto that farm, she felt something human, something that wasn't just dust, weight, and silence. Thanks, she said, tucking the branch under her arm. If you need help, just call me. I know the old man's got his ways, but you don't have to carry everything alone, okay? Sarah nodded, feeling a warmth in her chest. It wasn't love, not yet. It was relief, hope. The realization that good people still existed, even in places where everything seemed dried up. Jason waved goodbye casually and headed back to the barn. Sarah stood there for a moment, watching the sky turn red on the horizon. The wind rustled through the dry trees, and for the first time, she realized this place, no matter how harsh, might have something to offer beyond pain. Something was shifting, small but deep, and that something had a name. Jason. The sky that morning was overcast, painted in a dull gray that made everything feel quieter. It was as if even the earth was tired. Sarah woke up earlier than usual, with a strange feeling in her stomach, not hunger, not fear, just something she couldn't name. She dressed slowly, slipped on her mud-stained boots, and tied her hair into a loose bun. The day was going to be long, like all the others. Thomas was already on the porch, sitting in his wooden chair, a mug of coffee resting in his calloused hands. Steam rose in slow spirals, vanishing into the heavy morning air. He didn't say a word when she walked by, just gave a slight nod, as if that was enough to tell her to keep going. Sarah headed straight to the barn. It was the day she'd have to learn how to milk one of the most stubborn cows on the farm, a massive animal with dark fur and restless eyes. Jason had mentioned the challenge days earlier, laughing as if it were an inside joke between them. But Sarah didn't have the luxury of jokes. Here everything was learned by trial, or by mistake. The corral was slippery from the light rain the night before. Sarah took a deep breath, placed the metal bucket beneath the cow, and tried to get into position. It was her first time milking alone. Her hands trembled. The cow didn't help, snorting, shifting, stepping sideways as if trying to knock her over. Sarah tried again. She squeezed tightly, then gently. Nothing. The bucket remained empty. Frustration rose in her chest like a fever. Her breathing grew shallow, her face burned. Her hands were already slick with sweat, and the fear of failing, of disappointing again, made her chest ache. Then she heard footsteps behind her. She turned slowly, expecting Thomas's cold stare and some whispered scolding. But to her surprise, he said nothing. He simply walked over and crouched beside her. "You're squeezing wrong," he said in a low, raspy voice. Sarah widened her eyes. It was the first time he'd spoken to her without hardness. There was no judgment, no impatience, just a simple observation. "Like this?" she asked, trying to repeat the motion. Thomas didn't answer. He reached out and, with his rough fingers, gently guided her hand into place. Their skin touched for an instant, and it was the most human contact Sarah had felt since leaving her parents' house. He wasn't gentle in the usual sense, but there was something in the gesture that cracked a layer of ice between them. "It's about the rhythm," he said. "Not too hard, not too soft. Just steady. You get it?" She nodded, trying to steady her breathing. He demonstrated the motion a few times and then let her try. This time, a stream of milk hit the bottom of the bucket with a metallic splash. Small but victorious. Thomas stood, dusted off his pants, and said, "You'll get the hang of it. Every animal has its rhythm." Sarah looked up at him, surprised. There was something different in his gaze. Not quite tenderness, but maybe respect, a hint of acknowledgement. Thomas turned and walked away before she could be sure. She stayed there, kneeling beside the bucket, feeling a new tightness in her chest. It didn't come from pain, but from the possibility that maybe he wasn't just what he seemed. Maybe there were cracks in the walls he had built. And maybe if she kept trying, she might glimpse what was behind them. That day, Sarah worked with a bit more ease. She washed the tools more carefully, hummed softly while cleaning the stove, and reorganized the pantry. Something inside her had shifted. A thread of hope, no matter how thin, had been lit. That afternoon, Jason showed up to help her stack hay bales in the barn. He noticed the different light in her face and smiled. "You looked like you saw a ghost or got a gift." "Thomas helped me today," she said, as if still testing whether the sentence was real. Jason raised his eyebrows, surprised. "My dad helped. Now that's a miracle. Maybe he's getting soft with age." It wasn't like that. Just a quick gesture. "But he showed me how to milk properly." Jason nodded, more serious now. "He's not a bad man, Sarah. He's just closed off, like someone afraid to feel." Sarah fell quiet. She was starting to understand, slowly, like someone feeling their way through the dark. Thomas's gesture that morning, small as it was, had changed the way she saw him. She didn't trust him yet. There was still fear. But now there was also curiosity and a flicker of empathy. That night, dinner was simple: rice, stewed pumpkin, and braised meat. Sarah set the table more carefully than usual. She laid out a clean cloth, lit a small candle, and even picked a few dry twigs from the field to place in a cup as a centerpiece. She didn't know if Thomas would notice, but she did it anyway. He came in, washed his hands in silence, sat at the table and began eating. For several long minutes, neither of them spoke. Then between bites, he murmured, "Meat's good tonight." Sarah looked at him, almost in disbelief. It was the first time he had ever complimented something she made. It wasn't enthusiastic. There were no smiles, but the words came. And that was enough. "Thank you," she said, a small smile forming at the corner of her lips. Thomas nodded as if that was all that needed to be said. And maybe it was. After dinner, he stepped out onto the porch as always. Sarah washed the dishes slowly, unhurried. The sound of the water hitting the metal basin felt different that night, softer, as if the whole house had finally exhaled. Before going to bed, she peeked out the window and saw Thomas sitting there, looking at the horizon. The sky was clear now, with stars beginning to appear. His hat rested on his knee, and his shoulders, for a brief moment, seemed a little less heavy. Sarah lay down on the thin mattress and stared at the dark ceiling. For the first time, she didn't feel just tired. She felt something close to relief, as if she was finally being seen. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to see him too. The night fell colder than usual. A steady wind blew from the south, rustling the dry trees around the farm and carrying with it the distant scent of rain. Though no clouds were in sight, Sarah had finished her chores early that day, and something inside her, maybe a flicker of courage, led her to step out onto the porch after dinner. She found Thomas sitting in his usual chair, feet resting on the railing, his hat resting on his lap. His face was partially lit by the faint light from the living room, and his eyes were locked on the sky, as if searching for some hidden answer among the stars. Sarah hesitated, then walked over and quietly sat on the steps a few feet away. She held a mug of warm tea in her hands. The heat seemed to warm something more than just her fingers. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. It was the kind of silence that respects the weight of time. Thomas didn't send her away, he didn't even look at her. But he didn't move either, as if her presence no longer disturbed him. Sarah watched the sky, There weren't many stars visible, but the sound of the wind and the scent of the old wood around them created something almost sacred. She pulled her knees to her chest and stayed still, until Thomas spoke, quietly, almost to himself. "This time of year always brings that strange wind," he said, eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. "It was her favorite." Sarah didn't reply. She turned slightly toward him, listening. It was the first time he'd spoken about someone in the past. "My wife, her name was Helena," he said after a pause. "She was stubborn, joyful, loved walking barefoot through the fields and singing off-key during breakfast. Laughed at her own jokes. Always said the smell of the wind reminded her of childhood." Sarah felt her throat tighten. Thomas didn't sound like a man used to sharing feelings. Every word seemed to come with effort, like he had to dig into old pain just to say it out loud. "When she got sick, we thought it was just exhaustion. There was so much to do. Jason was little. Life was tough, but the exhaustion turned into pain. Then fever, and by the time we looked for help, it was too late." He paused, ran a hand over his face. His eyes were wet but steady. He didn't cry. He didn't let himself. But he was close. Cancer, fast, aggressive, the kind that eats everything from the inside. I watched her fade, watched the joy disappear, and I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to stop it. Sarah's heart ached. There was pain in his voice, but also guilt, heavy guilt, the kind that had lived in him for years. She didn't interrupt. She let him speak. She was the heart of the house. After she was gone, all that was left were the sounds of forks scraping plates, the creak of the door, the ticking clock, and a little boy who cried at night, asking why his mom wouldn't wake up. Thomas lowered his head. His gray hair hid part of his face. The empty coffee mug trembled slightly in his hands. I didn't know how to comfort, didn't know how to hold him. All I knew was work. I put the boy in the pen and told him he had to learn to be a man. And he took a deep breath. I became the kind of man I never wanted to be. Sarah could finally see what she hadn't before, the pain behind the harshness, the cracks in the hard shell he showed the world. Thomas wasn't just coal, he was broken deeply. Silence became my armor, he said like a confession. And when life handed me you, it felt like it was happening all over again. Something I didn't know how to take care of. That's why I was hard. That's why I pushed you away. I was afraid I'd break something else. Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek, not just for him, for everyone who had suffered in silence, for all the lives hardened by the effort to survive, for her mother, for herself, and now for Thomas. She set her mug aside and rested her arms on her knees. I come from silence too, she said softly. My mother never stood up for herself. My father, he was empty. I grew up thinking love was something you had to earn or endure. Thomas turned his head slowly, meeting her eyes for the first time that night. His eyes were red, but there was something there that had never been before. Vulnerability. Maybe that's why you're still here, he said. Because you didn't run, even when you could have. Even when I deserved for you to leave. Sarah took a breath. This wasn't a conversation she expected to have. Not with him, but somehow it felt inevitable, like they'd both been waiting for the right night, the right wind, to finally speak their truths. I didn't stay for you, she said gently. I stayed for me, because somehow I knew my story wasn't finished. And maybe this is where I'll learn how to rebuild. Thomas nodded. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves in the yard. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Then he got up from his chair, walked slowly to the step where Sarah sat and sat beside her. He didn't say anything, didn't touch her, just sat, present, open, human. They looked up at the sky together. In silence, Helena used to say, every wound has its own time to heal, Thomas murmured. Sometimes we just need to stop hiding the pain. Sarah smiled, a quiet, meaningful smile. Maybe she was right. That night, Sarah went to bed with a different feeling. The room was still dark. The mattress was still thin, but something had changed. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was just surviving. She was building slowly a connection, a possibility, and more than anything, she was beginning to understand that even the hardest people carry stories of pain. And sometimes all it takes is a quiet night and the sound of the wind for those stories to finally be told. Sarah had spent the whole morning noticing something that most people probably would have missed. On the old calendar hanging crookedly on the kitchen wall, one date was marked with a faint pencil line. October 14th. Thomas never mentioned birthdays, never celebrated anything, but there it was. That small, nearly faded mark, like a buried memory that still insisted on existing. She stared at that number for several minutes before realizing what she wanted to do. The idea came gently, like someone knocking quietly, but it began to grow inside her as the day drew near. It wasn't grand. It didn't involve expensive gifts or fancy words. It was just a gesture. Something simple, human. On the morning of the 14th, Sarah woke earlier than usual. She made coffee like always, fed the animals, swept the barnyard. Thomas, as he did every Saturday, had gone out to check the back fence and wouldn't be back until late afternoon, part of his ritual routine. With the house quiet, Sarah cleaned the kitchen with extra care. She washed the dish towels, dusted the windows, and picked wildflowers from the field. Small, scraggly, but colorful. She placed them in an old glass bottle as a vase. She found the least worn tablecloth and spread it over the wooden table. It was linen, frayed at the edges, but still lovely under the golden light of the afternoon. In the pantry, she found rice, beans, cornmeal, and a piece of salted meat left over from the week before. She cooked everything slowly, seasoned it with garlic, onion, and herbs from the yard. As she stirred the pot, she thought about how simple flavors could express things words never could. She made a small cornmeal cake. Nothing too sweet, nothing elaborate, but it smelled like home, like care. And while the oven warmed the kitchen, Sarah carefully set out clean cutlery, unchipped glasses, and a fresh cloth over the serving dish. When the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of red and orange, she lit the only candle she had found in the cupboard. It was thick, already used, but still steady. Its flame flickered gently, reflected in her eyes as she took a deep breath and looked at the result of her effort. It wasn't a celebration. It was just dinner, but it was the first intentional act of affection that House had seen in many, many years. Soon she heard Thomas's footsteps on the porch. Heavy, steady. The sound of his boots on the wooden floor announced his arrival before he even opened the door. He entered like he always did, hat on his head, face unreadable, hands dusty from the road. But as he stepped into the kitchen, he stopped and said nothing. Sarah stood beside the table, her apron still tied around her waist. She didn't speak. She just looked at him calmly. Her eyes said everything. Thomas scanned the room in silence. The tablecloth, the wildflowers, the hot food still steaming, the cake at the edge of the table, and the candle flickering gently in the soft breeze from the window. "What's this?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. "I saw the date on the calendar," she said. "Thought maybe it was your birthday." Thomas didn't answer right away. He looked at the candle, then at the plate set in front of him. For a moment, his shoulders seemed to drop. He removed his hat slowly, set it on the table, and sat down. Sarah sat too. She served herself and began to eat quietly. Thomas followed, the sound of their cutlery tapping the plates mixed with the warm smell of the food, filling the kitchen with an old, forgotten kind of comfort. "No one's made me dinner in over 20 years, he murmured, staring at his plate. Sarah didn't know what to say. She simply nodded, a faint smile on her lips. It felt like a confession. "Elena used to make rice with roasted meat on my birthday," he continued. "Said it was simple, but it reminded me of who I was before the land hardened everything." He spoke slowly, like someone opening an old box, afraid the contents might break. "Tonight, this table reminds me of her, not in a sad way, in a living way." Sarah felt her eyes well up, but she held it together. This was a night for respect, for listening. After dinner, she cut the cake into small slices, placed one in front of him and one in front of herself. The candle still burned steadily. Thomas stared at the cake for a few seconds before taking a bite. He chewed slowly, then wiped his mouth with a napkin and whispered, "Thank you." That simple word fell over Sarah like a breeze. She hadn't expected it, hadn't needed it, but receiving it, a genuine thank you, from him felt like a hug without arms, a bridge being built across a river that once seemed impossible to cross. "You deserve to be remembered," she said softly, "even if you think you don't." Thomas looked at her for a moment. There was a light in his eyes that wasn't from the candle. It was humanity, memory, gratitude. That night, Sarah blew out the candle gently, washed the dishes in silence, and went to bed with a new feeling, a sense that something was loosening slowly inside Thomas, as if that simple dinner had opened a door she hadn't known was there. And outside, under the clear sky and soft breeze, the farm felt a little less hard, a little less lonely, as if it too was slowly learning to feel like home again. The seasons were changing. The air, once filled with hot dust, now carried a quiet coolness, like even time itself was trying to soften the land. Dry leaves swayed more gently in the field, and the mornings arrived with a more golden, delicate light. Sarah felt these changes in her skin, in her breath, but more than anything, inside herself. There was something new in the air, something she couldn't name but couldn't ignore. It was on one of those mornings that Thomas did something unexpected. "Take the day off," he said, leaning against the fence, hat pulled low over his face. Sarah, already holding the hoe, looked at him in disbelief. "What? Come with me somewhere. I want to show you something." That invitation coming from him felt surreal. In all those months, he'd never made an invitation. Orders, yes. Instructions, many. But this was something else. Sarah hesitated, looked down at her boots, then back at him, and nodded. "Okay." They saddled 2 horses and set off in silence. Thomas led the way, steady, focused. Sarah followed behind, trying to match the rhythm of the animal and of her own heart. The land opened before them in narrow trails, trees forming tunnels of shadow, the sound of hooves breaking through dry grass. Neither of them spoke, but the silence was not awkward. It was peaceful, almost companionable. After half an hour of riding through valleys and hills, they reached a narrow turn, nearly hidden by brush. Thomas dismounted first and pushed the branches aside. "This way." Sarah dismounted and followed him. The path was uneven, full of roots, but at the end, she heard the sound of water, faint at first, then growing. And then she saw it. A small waterfall poured into a natural pool, surrounded by rocks and dense greenery. The water was crystal clear, and the sound of it filled the air with a gentle music. Sunlight slipped through the treetops, dancing on the surface like it had nowhere else to be. "I used to come here when I was a boy," Thomas said, his voice different. "It was the only place where I felt like I could breathe." Sarah looked at him. His expression had changed. There was nostalgia in it, yes, but also relief, as if this place had protected something the years couldn't steal. She stepped closer to the water, crouched down, and dipped her fingers in. It was cold, but inviting. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Thomas sat on a large rock, took off his hat and laid it beside him. He looked around like greeting an old friend. Sarah stayed standing, feet in the soft grass, observing every detail, the white foam of the fall, the dragonflies hovering above the pool, the birds hidden in the trees. "I brought Helena here once," he said after a pause. "Before everything fell apart," she cried from happiness. Said it was the most beautiful place she'd ever seen. Sarah sat beside him quietly. She sensed that here, more than ever, Thomas wasn't hiding. Not his body, but his soul, vulnerable, honest. "Sometimes I think I should have come back more often," he continued. "But after she passed, I avoided it. It reminded me too much of what I'd lost." Sarah took a deep breath. The smell of wet earth, the sound of water, it all surrounded them like a gentle blanket. And she felt the weight of that memory too, a weight he was now sharing. "And why bring me here today?" she asked softly. Thomas took his time answering. "Because..." He looked toward the horizon. "Maybe I'm ready to remember without hurting. Or maybe it's because you've reminded me of who I was before the pain." Sarah's heart skipped. That simple sentence pierced through her, quiet but powerful. They looked at each other. And in that look was everything they hadn't said. Gratitude, fear, warmth, contained. Longing. A lifetime of silence beginning to melt in a single moment. He moved first, slowly, gently. He leaned toward her without pressure, as if asking for permission with a gesture. And Sarah, without a word, allowed it. The kiss was soft, no urgency, no promises, just a deep, quiet truth, a touch that said, "I'm here." That said, it's not too late. When they pulled away, Thomas held her face for a moment. His thumb brushed her cheek with a tenderness no one would ever expect from his calloused hands. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he said. Sarah smiled, eyes shimmering. "I almost gave up on myself, but you gave me a reason not to." The wind picked up through the trees, carrying the leaves in slow spirals. It felt as though nature itself was bearing witness. The water kept flowing, clear and relentless, just like them. On the way back they rode side by side. The silence had returned, but now it was something new. A peaceful silence. A shared silence. The kind that speaks of belonging, of healing, of roots quietly growing deeper. By the time they reached the farm, the sky was painted in soft pinks, and the scent of burning wood drifted from a distant chimney. Sarah dismounted, adjusted the saddle, and looked at Thomas. "Thank you for today." He just nodded, but his eyes said everything. They were alive, honest. Sarah walked back to the house, her steps steady, grounded. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was merely surviving there. She felt like she was living. And more than that, being seen and maybe, just maybe, starting to love. Time no longer passed the same way on that farm. The weeks were no longer counted by pain, but by small everyday miracles. A harvest that took root. A dinner in silence that wasn't empty. A gentle touch on the shoulder. A look of quiet understanding. The house, once so quiet, now had sound. The sound of life, of hope. Sarah began noticing the changes in her body not long after the wedding. First came the tiredness, then the nausea, the heightened sensitivity. Thomas noticed too, not through words, but in the way she reacted to smells, in how often she lingered on the porch, eyes fixed on the sky. She only confirmed what she already suspected weeks later. While sitting at breakfast with Thomas, between spoonfuls of warm porridge, she quietly said, "We're going to have a baby." The silence that followed was heavier than usual. Thomas carefully placed his spoon on the table, slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers for a moment. Sarah thought he might withdraw, like he used to when something shook him. But what came next was different. He reached across the table, took her hand, and simply said, "Then this child will know love from the very first day." That sentence echoed in Sarah's chest throughout her entire pregnancy. She lived those months like someone walking slowly through a field of wildflowers. They never dreamed of reaching. Every little movement inside her belly felt like a new song. Every heartbeat she heard, for the first time in a village, midwife's makeshift office, was like a sign that it had all been worth it. Thomas remained quiet but always present. He took care of the heavy chores, managed the cattle pens, and prepared warm baths for Sarah on the harder days. At night, he sat beside her and rested his hand gently on her growing belly. A simple gesture, but full of reverence, as if grateful to witness something he never believed he deserved. "What if it's a girl?" Sarah asked one day with a playful smile. "Then she'll be the freest woman this world's ever seen," he replied. The name had been chosen long ago, though neither admitted they had dreamed of it since the early months. Gabriel. A strong name, a name full of hope. Labor began in the early hours of a stormy morning. Rain fell hard against the roof, and thunder rattled the windows. Sarah woke with a deep ache, like something tearing through her. It was time. Thomas was already awake, and as if he'd known, he rushed to Jason's room. Jason had returned to the farm to help during the final days, and together they saddled the horses under pouring rain to fetch Donna Lourdes, the experienced village midwife. Meanwhile, Sarah paced through the house, steadying herself on walls, breathing deep, recalling everything she'd learned, positions, breathing, words of calm. The pain came in waves, but she was steady, ready. When Donna Lourdes arrived, with Jason and Thomas dripping wet behind her, the house was already warm. Water boiled on the stove. Clean towels waited by the bedside. Everything was simple but prepared. The hours that followed were intense. Sarah screamed, cried, breathed through the pain, closed her eyes and surrendered with silent courage. Thomas stayed outside, kneeling under the porch roof, hands clasped tight, face buried in his palms. He was a man of few words, but that morning his prayers were clear. The cry came with the sun. Gabriel was born with a strong wail, waving arms and a thick tuft of dark hair. Donna Lourdes wrapped him in a heavy cloth and placed him in Sarah's trembling arms. She was exhausted but whole. Thomas entered the room slowly. He stopped at the edge of the bed, as if asking permission, not just to step inside the room, but into this sacred moment. Sarah held out the baby to him. "This is our Gabriel." Thomas took him with hands that had handled barbed wire, cattle, and tools, but now trembled holding something so fragile. He stared at his son's face for a long time in silence. Then in a rough, emotional voice, he said, "You are the beginning of everything I never knew could exist." He sat beside the bed holding the baby. Sarah looked at him like someone witnessing a miracle. That morning, sunlight poured through the window. Birds sang outside. The farm, once marked by silence and grief, now echoed with the most precious sound of all, the cry of a newborn. And in that small, simple house, whose walls had known more silence than tenderness, something new had taken root. A new beginning, a quiet promise. Sarah drifted to sleep with a smile on her lips. Thomas rocked Gabriel with awkward, loving movements, and in that moment, everything was at peace. Time passed with the same quiet slowness as things that are carefully tended. Gabriel grew up surrounded by love, gentle silence, steady hands, and open hearts. The farm, once hardened by pain, now felt like a different place. The soil remained dry, the sun still harsh during dry months, but something had changed. A soft, constant presence now lived there. It was as if love had taken root and begun to bloom. Sarah became the living heart of that home. She raised Gabriel with both tenderness and strength. She taught him to respect the animals, to touch the earth gently, to notice the cycles of nature. Thomas watched them quietly from the porch. Sometimes he spent hours just observing mother and son in the yard, as if trying to memorize every movement, every laugh, every moment. Gabriel, now 2, was curious and brave. He chased chickens, drew pictures in the dirt with sticks, and laughed loudly when Jason lifted him onto his shoulders. He called Thomas Daddy naturally, and Sarah Mom, with the certainty of someone who knew they were loved. The scars of the past didn't vanish. Sarah still woke now and then with memories, the day she was sold, her absent father, the pain of being discarded. But now, when she opened her eyes and saw Gabriel sleeping beside her, she felt she had conquered something deep. She had turned pain into roots and roots into life. Thomas hadn't forgotten either, but he had learned to speak. Slowly, he began telling stories to his son. He spoke of Helena with respect and longing, and he spoke of Sarah with tenderness, the woman who taught him to love again, even when he thought it was too late. The farm flourished, not with riches but with stability. The chickens laid more eggs, the garden bloomed with herbs and vegetables, and the barn was rebuilt with Jason's help and 2 neighbors who had become friends. Life went on, simple but whole. One quiet afternoon, Thomas invited Sarah to walk with him to the sunflower field, a part of the land she rarely visited. The trail was long, flanked by tall shrubs and the sweet scent of green grass. At the top of the hill, the field opened wide like a golden carpet. The sunflowers, planted by Jason months earlier, danced in the wind. Thomas took off his hat and gazed over the yellow sea for a long time before speaking. "I thought I didn't deserve happiness," he said. "For years, I carried guilt like it was part of my body. But then you came, not demanding, not forcing, just staying. And what's bloomed inside me, it's bigger than anything I've lost." Sarah didn't answer right away. She simply held his hand, looked at this man who had once been stone, now soft, fertile ground. "What we built here, Thomas, we built from what was left, from broken pieces. But even shards shine if the light hits them right." He smiled, "And the light has always hit you differently." There, among the sunflowers, they kissed, with the calm of 2 people who knew that time was now on their side. There was no more rush, No more fear, only the certainty that love, when chosen every day, could turn even the driest land into shelter. Later, sitting on the porch, with Gabriel asleep in Sarah's lap and Jason quietly strumming a makeshift guitar, Thomas looked up at the sky and said, "I thought this land would be my end, but it became my beginning." Sarah rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "We don't get to choose where we're born, but we can choose where we bloom." And that's how it was. The old wooden house, now with flowers on its windows, had become a home where love was built, patiently, persistently. A place where silences had stopped being walls and became bridges, where the past was no longer a prison, but a foundation. Sarah, once a girl so like property, had become a woman, a mother, and the keeper of a legacy she created herself. Thomas, once a lonely farmer, had become a partner, a father, a whole man. And Gabriel, that little boy with curious eyes, grew up in a love that didn't come ready, but came strong. And so, in a forgotten corner of land, a story bloomed that no one expected. Not a fairy tale, not a miracle, but real. And because of that, extraordinary. Because sometimes the most beautiful kind of love doesn't come with grand gestures. It comes with a choice, with courage, with a new beginning. And on that dry patch of land, love chose to stay. Time no longer passed the same way on that farm. The weeks were no longer counted by pain, but by small everyday miracles. A harvest that took root, a dinner in silence that wasn't empty, a gentle touch on the shoulder, a look of quiet understanding. The house, once so quiet, now had sound. The sound of life, of hope. Sarah began noticing the changes in her body not long after the wedding. First came the tiredness, then the nausea, the heightened sensitivity. Thomas noticed too, not through words, but in the way she reacted to smells, in how often she lingered on the porch, eyes fixed on the sky. She only confirmed what she already suspected weeks later. While sitting at breakfast with Thomas, between spoonfuls of warm porridge, she quietly said, "We're going to have a baby." The silence that followed was heavier than usual. Thomas carefully placed his spoon on the table, slowly lifted his eyes to meet hers for a moment. Sarah thought he might withdraw, like he used to when something shook him. But what came next was different. He reached across the table, took her hand, and simply said, "Then this child will know love from the very first day." That sentence echoed in Sarah's chest throughout her entire pregnancy. She lived those months like someone walking slowly through a field of wildflowers. They never dreamed of reaching. Every little movement inside her belly felt like a new song. Every heartbeat she heard, for the first time in a village, midwife's makeshift office, was like a sign that it had all been worth it. Thomas remained quiet but always present. He took care of the heavy chores, managed the cattle pens, and prepared warm baths for Sarah on the harder days. At night, he sat beside her and rested his hand gently on her growing belly. A simple gesture, but full of reverence, as if grateful to witness something he never believed he deserved. "What if it's a girl?" Sarah asked one day with a playful smile. "Then she'll be the freest woman this world's ever seen," he replied. The name had been chosen long ago, though neither admitted they had dreamed of it since the early months. Gabriel. A strong name, a name full of hope. Labor began in the early hours of a stormy morning. Rain fell hard against the roof, and thunder rattled the windows. Sarah woke with a deep ache, like something tearing through her. It was time. Thomas was already awake, and as if he'd known, he rushed to Jason's room. Jason had returned to the farm to help during the final days, and together they saddled the horses under pouring rain to fetch Donna Lourdes, the experienced village midwife. Meanwhile, Sarah paced through the house, steadying herself on walls, breathing deep, recalling everything she'd learned, positions, breathing, words of calm. The pain came in waves, but she was steady, ready. When Donna Lourdes arrived, with Jason and Thomas dripping wet behind her, the house was already warm. Water boiled on the stove. Clean towels waited by the bedside. Everything was simple but prepared. The hours that followed were intense. Sarah screamed, cried, breathed through the pain, closed her eyes and surrendered with silent courage. Thomas stayed outside, kneeling under the porch roof, hands clasped tight, face buried in his palms. He was a man of few words, but that morning his prayers were clear. The cry came with the sun. Gabriel was born with a strong wail, waving arms, and a thick tuft of dark hair. Donna Lourdes wrapped him in a heavy cloth and placed him in Sarah's trembling arms. She was exhausted but whole. Thomas entered the room slowly. He stopped at the edge of the bed, as if asking permission, not just to step inside the room, but into this sacred moment. Sarah held out the baby to him. "This is our Gabriel." Thomas took him with hands that had handled barbed wire, cattle, and tools, but now trembled holding something so fragile. He stared at his son's face for a long time in silence. Then in a rough, emotional voice, he said, "You are the beginning of everything I never knew could exist." He sat beside the bed holding the baby. Sarah looked at him like someone witnessing a miracle. That morning, sunlight poured through the window. Birds sang outside. The farm, once marked by silence and grief, now echoed with the most precious sound of all, the cry of a newborn. And in that small, simple house, whose walls had known more silence than tenderness, something new had taken root. A new beginning, a quiet promise. Sarah drifted to sleep with a smile on her lips. Thomas rocked Gabriel with awkward, loving movements, and in that moment, everything was at peace. Time passed with the same quiet slowness as things that are carefully tended. Gabriel grew up surrounded by love, gentle silence, steady hands, and open hearts. The farm, once hardened by pain, now felt like a different place. The soil remained dry, the sun still harsh during dry months, but something had changed. A soft, constant presence now lived there. It was as if love had taken root and begun to bloom. Sarah became the living heart of that home. She raised Gabriel with both tenderness and strength. She taught him to respect the animals, to touch the earth gently, to notice the cycles of nature. Thomas watched them quietly from the porch. Sometimes he spent hours just observing mother and son in the yard, as if trying to memorize every movement, every laugh, every moment. Gabriel, now 2, was curious and brave. He chased chickens, drew pictures in the dirt with sticks, and laughed loudly when Jason lifted him onto his shoulders. He called Thomas Daddy naturally, and Sarah Mom, with the certainty of someone who knew they were loved. The scars of the past didn't vanish. Sarah still woke now and then with memories. The day she was sold, her absent father, the pain of being discarded. But now, when she opened her eyes and saw Gabriel sleeping beside her, she felt she had conquered something deep. She had turned pain into roots and roots into life. Thomas hadn't forgotten either, but he had learned to speak. Slowly, he began telling stories to his son. He spoke of Helena with respect and longing, and he spoke of Sarah with tenderness, the woman who taught him to love again, even when he thought it was too late. The farm flourished, not with riches but with stability. The chickens laid more eggs, the garden bloomed with herbs and vegetables, and the barn was rebuilt with Jason's help and 2 neighbors who had become friends. Life went on, simple but whole. One quiet afternoon, Thomas invited Sarah to walk with him to the sunflower field, a part of the land she rarely visited. The trail was long, flanked by tall shrubs and the sweet scent of green grass. At the top of the hill, the field opened wide like a golden carpet. The sunflowers, planted by Jason months earlier, danced in the wind. Thomas took off his hat and gazed over the yellow sea for a long time before speaking. "I thought I didn't deserve happiness," he said. "For years, I carried guilt like it was part of my body. But then you came, not demanding, not forcing, just staying. And what's bloomed inside me, it's bigger than anything I've lost." Sarah didn't answer right away. She simply held his hand, looked at this man who had once been stone, now soft, fertile ground. "What we built here, Thomas, we built from what was left, from broken pieces. But even shards shine if the light hits them right." He smiled, "And the light has always hit you differently." There, among the sunflowers, they kissed, with the calm of 2 people who knew that time was now on their side. There was no more rush, no more fear, only the certainty that love, when chosen every day, could turn even the driest land into shelter. Later, sitting on the porch, with Gabriel asleep in Sarah's lap and Jason quietly strumming a makeshift guitar, Thomas looked up at the sky and said, "I thought this land would be my end, but it became my beginning." Sarah rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "We don't get to choose where we're born, but we can choose where we bloom." And that's how it was. The old wooden house, now with flowers on its windows, had become a home where love was built, patiently, persistently. A place where silences had stopped being walls and became bridges, where the past was no longer a prison, but a foundation. Sarah, once a girl so like property, had become a woman, a mother, and the keeper of a legacy she created herself. Thomas, once a lonely farmer, had become a partner, a father, a whole man. And Gabriel, that little boy with curious eyes, grew up in a love that didn't come ready, but came strong. And so, in a forgotten corner of land, a story bloomed that no one expected. Not a fairy tale, not a miracle, but real. And because of that, extraordinary. Because sometimes the most beautiful kind of love doesn't come with grand gestures. It comes with a choice, with courage, with a new beginning. And on that dry patch of land, love chose to stay.